Hello, welcome to the rise of ancient Egypt, from river to pyramid. A full history of one of the greatest empires to have ever existed. So get snuggled up and comfortable, close your eyes, and let me tell you about the history of Egypt. Make sure to hit that subscribe button, like the video, and leave a comment. Before the rise of pyramids, before the reign of pharaohs, before even the first hieroglyph was carved into stone, there was the Nile, a ribbon of life cutting through an endless sea of desert. The Nile River shaped one of the most remarkable civilizations in human history. But long before Egypt became a kingdom of gods and kings, it was something far more fragile and far more human. This is the story of Egypt before history was written. Tens of thousands of years ago, the region we now call Egypt looked very different. The Sahara Desert, now one of the driest places on Earth, was once a land of grasslands, lakes, and wildlife. Early human groups roamed freely across this fertile environment, hunting animals and gathering wild plants. But over time, the climate began to change. Rainfall diminished, lakes dried up. The green Sahara slowly transformed into the vast desert we know today. As the land became harsher and less forgiving, human populations were forced to adapt or move. And so, they migrated, not randomly, but toward a lifeline that would define their future: the Nile River. The Nile was unlike any other river in the ancient world. Each year, like clockwork, it flooded its banks. These floods were not destructive in the way modern floods often are. Instead, they were predictable, gentle, and essential. As the waters receded, they left behind a rich layer of dark, fertile soil, perfect for growing crops. In a land surrounded by desert, the Nile created a narrow strip of life. And it was here, around 6000 BCE, that human communities began to settle permanently. These early settlers were no longer just hunters and gatherers. Gradually, they began to cultivate the land. They grew wheat and barley. They domesticated animals such as cattle, sheep, and goats. They built simple homes using mud and reeds from the riverbanks. This transition from a nomadic lifestyle to a settled agricultural one was one of the most important turning points in human history. With farming came stability. With stability came growth, and with growth came complexity. As generations passed, small villages began to form along the Nile. These communities were often self-sufficient, relying on farming, fishing, and basic craftsmanship. But they were not isolated. Even at this early stage, people began to trade with neighboring groups. They exchanged tools made of stone and later copper, pottery and crafted goods, food and raw materials. These interactions helped spread ideas, technologies, and cultural practices. And slowly, something new began to emerge: identity. The people of prehistoric Egypt were innovators in their own right. They developed increasingly sophisticated tools, first from stone, then later incorporating metals like copper. Pottery became more refined, not only functional, but decorative. Patterns and symbols began to appear, hinting at early forms of communication and artistic expression. They also developed techniques for weaving, carving, and construction. But perhaps most revealing of all were their burial practices. Even in these early times, the people of the Nile Valley showed a deep concern for what happened after death. Burials were not random. Bodies were carefully placed in shallow graves, often accompanied by tools, food, and personal items. This suggests a belief, however simple, that life continued in some form beyond death. Over time, these burial practices became more elaborate. Graves were lined, bodies were positioned deliberately. Offerings became more significant. These early rituals would eventually evolve into one of the most complex belief systems about the afterlife the world has ever seen. But at this stage, they were just beginning. As settlements grew and populations increased, cultural differences began to emerge. Two major regions developed along the Nile. Upper Egypt in the south, where the Nile cuts through a narrow valley surrounded by cliffs, and Lower Egypt in the north, where the river fans out into a wide, fertile delta before meeting the Mediterranean Sea. Despite what their names suggest, Upper Egypt is actually upstream, closer to the source of the Nile, while Lower Egypt lies downstream. These regions were not just geographically distinct, they became culturally and politically different as well. Upper Egypt was defined by its landscape. The Nile flowed through a tight corridor bordered by desert cliffs. Arable land was limited but highly fertile. Communities here tended to be more linear, stretched along the riverbanks. Because space was constrained, settlements were often closer together, which may have encouraged stronger local organization and competition. Over time, Upper Egypt developed its own symbols of identity. One of the most notable was the white crown, a tall, conical headdress that would later represent kingship in the south. Art from this region often shows strong, bold figures and scenes of power, early hints of centralized authority beginning to take shape. In contrast, Lower Egypt was wide and expansive. The Nile Delta spread out into multiple branches, creating a marshy, fertile region rich in resources. Fishing and agriculture thrived here. The environment was more open, which may have led to a different style of settlement, less concentrated, more dispersed. Lower Egypt developed its own distinct identity, symbolized by the red crown, a low, flat-topped headdress with a projecting curl. Its culture reflected its environment, abundant, connected, and outward-looking. Though both regions depended on the Nile, they evolved separately. They had different leadership structures, different artistic styles, different religious practices, different symbols of power. At times, they may have cooperated, At other times, they likely competed. This duality, two lands along one river, would become one of the defining features of Egyptian civilization. Even after unification, Egyptian rulers would always carry symbols representing both Upper and Lower Egypt, because the memory of division never fully disappeared. The growth of trade networks. As these societies developed, they did not remain isolated. Trade expanded far beyond the Nile Valley. To the south, they connected with Nubia, a region rich in gold, ivory, and exotic materials. To the northeast, they reached into the Levant, exchanging goods and ideas with early Near Eastern cultures. Through these networks, Egypt gained access to precious stones, metals, timber, which was scarce in the Nile region. But trade did more than move goods. It moved knowledge, technologies, artistic styles, and cultural influences began to flow into Egypt, enriching its development. By the time we approach 3100 BCE, something remarkable had happened. What began as scattered groups of hunter-gatherers had transformed into organized, interconnected societies. They had established permanent settlements, developed agriculture, created trade networks, formed distinct cultural identities, begun experimenting with leadership and social hierarchy. In Upper Egypt especially, evidence suggests that powerful regional leaders were beginning to emerge, figures who controlled land, resources, and people. These early rulers laid the groundwork for something much larger. Tension and interaction between Upper and Lower Egypt increased over time. Competition likely grew over resources, trade routes, and influence. Eventually, this would lead to one of the most significant turning points in human history: the unification of Egypt. A single ruler would bring together the two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt, under one crown. And with that moment, Egypt would step out of prehistory and into history. But none of that would have been possible without what came before. Without the shifting climate that pushed people toward the Nile. Without the farmers who learned to work its soil. Without the communities that built, traded, and believed. Long before the monuments, long before the myths, there were people. And along the banks of a river, they began one of the greatest stories ever told. There comes a moment in every civilization story when scattered voices become one, when competing lands become a single nation. For ancient Egypt, that moment changed everything. Around 3100 BCE, along the fertile banks of the Nile, a transformation took place, one so profound that it would echo for thousands of years. Two lands, divided by geography, culture, and power, would become one. And from that union, a civilization was born. Before unification, Egypt was not a single country. It was a patchwork of regional powers. Small kingdoms and chiefdoms lined the Nile, each with its own leaders, traditions, and ambitions. Some were little more than clusters of villages. Others had grown into influential centers of power, controlling trade routes, farmland, and people. In Upper Egypt particularly, certain cities began to rise above the rest. Places like Hierakonpolis, Nakada, and Abydos became hubs of authority, centers where wealth accumulated and leadership solidified. Archaeological evidence reveals something striking. These communities were no longer equal. Graves of elite individuals were larger, richer, and filled with valuable goods. Ivory carvings, finely crafted pottery, jewelry made from imported materials. Power was concentrating. Hierarchy was forming. And with hierarchy came ambition. At some point, leadership evolved beyond simple chieftains. Power became centralized in individuals who ruled not just villages, but entire regions. These early rulers were something new. They were not yet the fully divine pharaohs of later periods, but they were becoming more than human leaders. They commanded labor. They controlled resources. They led in times of conflict. And perhaps, most importantly, they began to project an image of authority that extended beyond life itself. In burial sites from this era, rulers were interred with symbols of power, ceremonial maces, carved palettes, and ornate regalia. These were not just tools. They were statements, declarations that power could be seen, displayed, remembered. Unification did not happen peacefully. Evidence suggests a period of intense competition, possibly warfare, between rival regions. Artifacts such as ceremonial palettes depict scenes of conquest, defeated enemies, captured territories, rulers asserting dominance. Among these artifacts, one stands above all others: the Narmer palette. Carved from stone, this object is both a work of art and a political statement. It shows a ruler, believed to be Narmer, wearing the crown of Upper Egypt on one side, and the crown of Lower Egypt on the other. In one image, he raises a mace over a kneeling enemy. In another, he inspects rows of defeated foes. This is not subtle imagery. It is a declaration. Power has been seized. Enemies have been subdued. The land has been united. Whether known as Narmer or Menes, the figure credited with unifying Egypt stands at the threshold between myth and history. We cannot know every detail of his life, but we can understand his significance. He was the ruler who accomplished what no one before him had. He brought together Upper and Lower Egypt under a single authority. This was not just a political achievement. It was a conceptual revolution. For the first time, the idea of Egypt as one unified entity existed. And with that idea came the need to maintain it. Even after unification, the distinction between Upper and Lower Egypt did not disappear. Instead, it became part of the identity of the new Adolit. The ruler now bore symbols of both regions: the white crown of Upper Egypt, the red crown of Lower Egypt. Combined, they formed the double crown, representing dominion over the two lands. This symbolism was not decorative, it was essential. It reminded the people and the ruler himself that unity was something to be maintained, not taken for granted. With a unified kingdom came the need for a center of power. That center became Memphis. Strategically located near the boundary between Upper and Lower Egypt, Memphis was perfectly positioned to control both regions. From here, the king could oversee administration, coordinate trade, deploy resources efficiently. Memphis became more than a city. It became the heart of the new Adolit, a place where decisions were made, where authority was enforced, and where the machinery of governance began to take shape. A unified kingdom cannot function without organization. And so, one of the most important developments of this period was the rise of bureaucracy. Officials were appointed to manage different aspects of society: agriculture, taxation, labor, trade. Records had to be kept, resources had to be tracked, and for that, a new tool became essential. During the early dynastic period, hieroglyphic writing began to take recognizable form. At first, it was used for practical purposes, marking ownership, recording goods, identifying individuals. But it quickly evolved into something more. Writing became a way to preserve authority, to record achievements, to communicate across time. Symbols carved into stone or written on papyrus allowed the king's power to extend beyond his physical presence. Words became permanent, and with permanence came legacy. As the state grew stronger, so too did the image of the ruler. The king was no longer just a political leader. He became something greater, a divine figure, an intermediary between gods and humans, responsible for maintaining Ma'at, the cosmic order that kept the universe in balance. If the Nile flooded properly, if crops grew, if the land remained stable, it was because the king was fulfilling his role. This belief system was powerful. It did more than justify authority. It made it sacred. Religion played a crucial role in unifying Egypt. Different regions had their own local gods, But under a unified kingdom, these beliefs began to merge into a more cohesive system. The king stood at the center of this system. Temples were built, rituals were performed, offerings were made, all reinforcing the idea that the stability of Egypt depended on maintaining harmony between the divine and the earthly. For ordinary people, unification brought both change and continuity. Life still revolved around the Nile, farming during the growing season, harvesting crops, maintaining irrigation systems. But now, there was a larger structure above them. Taxes were collected. Labor could be organized for large projects. The state could mobilize people in ways that smaller communities never could. This laid the foundation for the monumental achievements that would come later. Though the Great Pyramids were still centuries away, the early dynastic period saw the beginnings of monumental architecture. Royal tombs at places like Abydos became increasingly elaborate. These were not just burial sites. They were symbols of power, built to endure, built to impress, built to connect the ruler to eternity. Despite its success, early unification was not guaranteed to last. Maintaining control over such a long and diverse land required constant effort. Communication was limited. Travel was slow. Local leaders still held influence. The king's authority had to be reinforced continuously through symbols, rituals, administration, and sometimes force. But the foundation had been laid. Closing tone, reflective, building anticipation. From the union of two lands came a kingdom. From that kingdom came one of the most enduring civilizations in history. The early dynastic period was not yet the age of pyramids, nor the height of Egypt's power. But it was the beginning of something extraordinary, a system of rule, a vision of order, a belief in unity, all forged along the banks of a river that continued to shape everything. A kingdom can be created in a moment of conquest, but to endure, it must be built, strengthened, and defended, day by day, year by year, generation by generation. After the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, the challenge was no longer victory. It was stability. What had been joined together could just as easily fall apart. And so, the rulers who followed faced a new and far more complex task: to transform a fragile union into a lasting state. The first kings of unified Egypt inherited more than land. They inherited responsibility on a scale never seen before in the Nile Valley. From the marshes of the delta in the north to the narrow cliffs of the southern valley, Egypt stretched across hundreds of miles. Each region had its own traditions, its own loyalties, its own local leaders. Holding this vast territory together required more than force. It required vision. As power stabilized, kingship became more structured. Rulers were no longer isolated figures rising to power through conflict alone. Instead, authority began to pass through family lines, forming the earliest dynasties. This continuity was essential. It created predictability. It reinforced legitimacy, and it allowed the idea of kingship to grow beyond the individual ruler into something enduring. The king was no longer just a man. He was part of a lineage, a living link in an unbroken chain of authority. The word dynasty would come much later, but the idea began here. A sequence of rulers connected by blood, inheritance, and divine right. This concept helped solidify the Adola in several ways. It reduced disputes over succession. It strengthened loyalty to the ruling family. It reinforced the idea that kingship was ordained, not seized. Over time, royal identity became increasingly formalized. Names, titles, and symbols were carefully chosen and repeated. Each ruler built upon the image of those who came before. Early kings began to adopt formalized names tied to divine symbolism. One of the most important was the Horus name. Horus, the falcon god, was associated with kingship and the sky. By linking themselves to Horus, rulers positioned themselves as earthly embodiments of divine power. These names were often written inside a sarek, a rectangular frame representing the palace facade, topped by the falcon of Horus. This was more than decoration. It was a message. The king is not just ruling from the palace. He is the living presence of divine authority within it. To maintain unity, the king's influence had to extend into every corner of Egypt. This required a system of control that was both practical and symbolic. Officials were appointed across the Blad, acting as representatives of the king's will. These early administrators collected taxes in the form of grain and goods, oversaw agricultural production, managed labor forces, maintained order. The Nile itself became a highway of control. Boats carried officials, messages, and resources up and down the river, connecting distant regions to the center. Slowly, the Adola began to function as a single, coordinated system. At the heart of this system was taxation. But unlike modern currency-based systems, wealth in early Egypt was measured in goods, grain, livestock, textiles, raw materials. The state collected these resources and redistributed them as needed. This allowed the king to support workers and officials, fund construction projects, maintain stability during times of scarcity. taxation was not just economic, it was a demonstration of authority. It showed that the king's reach extended into everyday life. One of the most remarkable achievements of early Egypt was its ability to organize large groups of people. Labor could be mobilized for building projects, irrigation systems, transport of goods. This was not slavery in the later sense, but a form of state-organized labor, often tied to seasonal cycles. When the Nile flooded and farming paused, workers could be redirected toward construction and adolid projects. This system maximized productivity and reinforced unity. People were not just living in Egypt, they were working for it. As the state expanded, religion became even more central to governance. The king's role as a divine figure was emphasized through rituals, ceremonies, temple offerings. These acts were not optional. They were essential to maintaining Ma'at, the balance and order of the universe. If the king performed his duties correctly, the world remained stable. If he failed, chaos could return. This belief system created a powerful feedback loop. The king maintained order leads to the land, prospered leads to his authority, was reinforced. Certain locations became deeply associated with royal and religious power. Abydos in Upper Egypt emerged as one of the most important burial sites for early kings. Here, rulers were laid to rest in elaborate tombs, surrounded by goods and offerings meant to sustain them in the afterlife. These sites were not hidden. They were visible symbols of continuity, places where the living could connect with the legacy of past rulers, royal tombs, and the afterlife. Early dynastic tombs became increasingly complex. They included multiple chambers, storage areas for goods, decorative elements. Some tombs were surrounded by subsidiary burials, possibly servants or retainers meant to accompany the king into the afterlife. This practice, though later abandoned, reveals the depth of belief in life beyond death. The king's power did not end with his life. It extended into eternity. While internal unity was a priority, external threats could not be ignored. Egypt's borders were not isolated. To the south lay Nubia, a region rich in resources, but also a potential rival. To the northeast, connections with the Levant brought both trade and tension. Early kings conducted expeditions beyond Egypt's borders to secure resources, to establish influence, to prevent threats. These were not large-scale empires yet, but they marked the beginning of Egypt's outward expansion. Power in early dynastic Egypt was reinforced through visual symbolism. Rulers were often depicted, larger than other figures, in dominant poses, wearing crowns and regalia. Objects like ceremonial maces and carved palettes continued to play a role, not just as tools, but as propaganda. They told stories of victory, order, and control. Even those who could not read could understand the message. The king is powerful. The king is victorious. The king maintains order. Despite growing centralization, local leaders still held influence. Governors and regional elites managed day-to-day affairs in their areas. The success of the state depended on balancing central authority, local cooperation. Too much control could lead to resistance. Too little could lead to fragmentation. The rulers of this period navigated this balance carefully, laying the groundwork for a dowlate that could endure. One of the most powerful tools of consolidation was repetition. Rituals were performed the same way, year after year. Symbols were reused, titles were preserved. This created a sense of permanence. Even as individual rulers changed, the structure of the Adola remained familiar, predictable, stable. By the end of the early dynastic period, Egypt was no longer an experiment in unity. It was a functioning Adola. It had a centralized hukumat, a system of administration, established dharmic practices, defined royal traditions, expanding economic networks. The foundations were firmly in place. What began as a fragile union had become something far more resilient. Closing tone, building toward the future, slightly more awe and anticipation. The kings of this era did not build the pyramids. They did not command vast empires. But they did something just as important. They created the system that made all of that possible. They transformed unity into stability, power into structure, and leadership into legacy. And as the early dynastic period drew to a close, Egypt stood ready to enter a new age, an age of monumental ambition, of architectural wonders, of rulers who would reach for eternity itself. There was a time when nothing on earth rose higher than mud brick walls and simple shrines. A time when kings were buried beneath the desert, in structures that would one day vanish into sand. But that time was ending. Because in Egypt, something extraordinary was about to begin. Not just a change in leadership, not just a shift in power, but a transformation in how humans understood permanence, legacy, and eternity. This was the dawn of the Old Kingdom, and with it, the birth of monuments that would defy time itself. The early dynastic period had done its work. Egypt was unified. Its rulers were established. Its systems, administrative, religious, and cultural, were in place. But stability creates something new. It creates ambition. No longer consumed by the struggle to hold the land together, Egypt's rulers began to look beyond survival, toward legacy. The question was no longer, how do we rule? But instead, how will we be remembered? Until this point, most structures in Egypt were built from materials that did not last. Mud brick, wood, reeds. These were practical but temporary. They eroded, collapsed, disappeared. But the Egyptian worldview was changing. The king was no longer just a ruler of the living world. He was an eternal being, a divine presence whose existence continued beyond death. And if the king was eternal, then his resting place had to be eternal too. The transition to monumental architecture did not happen instantly. It began as an evolution. Early royal tombs, known as mastabas, were rectangular structures with sloping sides, built above underground burial chambers. They were larger and more elaborate than anything before, but still limited by traditional materials. Then came a revolutionary idea. What if these structures were not built from mud brick, but from stone? Stone did not decay like brick. It did not yield to time in the same way. It endured. And in that endurance, it offered something new: immortality. At the center of this transformation stands one figure, a king of the third dynasty, a ruler named Djoser. Under his reign, Egypt would take its first true step into monumental architecture. But even kings do not build alone. Behind this leap forward was a mind unlike any before it, a visionary, an architect, a man whose name would echo through history. Imhotep was more than an architect. He was a polymath, a master of many disciplines: engineering, medicine, administration, religious knowledge. But it was his role as designer of Djoser's tomb that changed the course of history. Instead of constructing a traditional mastaba, Imhotep envisioned something far more ambitious. He would stack mastabas, one on top of another, creating a structure that rose toward the sky, layer by layer, step by step. The world's first pyramid took shape. Rising from the desert at Saqqara, the step pyramid was unlike anything ever seen before. It was not just a tomb, it was a statement, a declaration of power, innovation, and divine connection. Surrounding the pyramid was an entire complex: courtyards, temples, ceremonial structures, walls enclosing sacred space. This was not simply a burial site. It was a carefully designed environment for eternity. Every stone placed with intention, every space aligned with purpose. Building in stone required entirely new techniques. Workers had to quarry massive blocks, transport them across land, lift and position them with precision. Tools were simple by modern standards. There were no cranes, no machines, only human ingenuity. Ramps were constructed, levers were used. Labor was organized on an unprecedented scale. This was not chaos. It was coordination. Thousands of workers moving in rhythm, guided by planning, leadership, and shared purpose. Contrary to popular myths, these builders were not slaves in chains. They were skilled laborers, farmers working during the Nile's flood season, craftsmen, and specialists. They were fed, housed, and organized by the state. Their work was not just labor, it was participation in something greater, a national effort, a collective act of creation tied to religion, identity, and El-Mulk. The pyramid was not just an architectural achievement, it was a religious one. Its shape, rising upward in steps, may have symbolized a pathway to the heavens, a stairway for the king's soul to ascend and join the gods. The entire complex reflected beliefs about the afterlife, divine order, the eternal nature of kingship. Temples within the complex allowed for ongoing rituals, ensuring the king's spirit remained nourished. Even in death, the king ruled. The success of the step pyramid changed everything. It proved that stone could be mastered, massive structures could be built, the state could mobilize resources on an enormous scale, and once something is proven possible, it becomes a foundation for even greater ambition. Following Djoser, later rulers continued to experiment. But it was Sneferu, founder of the 4th dynasty, who pushed pyramid construction to new heights. He did not build just one pyramid. He built multiple, each representing a step forward in engineering. One of Sneferu's most famous projects is the bent pyramid. At first glance, it appears unusual. Its angle changes partway up, creating a distinctive bent shape. This was not intentional design, it was adaptation. Early construction methods led to structural instability, forcing builders to adjust the angle to prevent collapse. This pyramid stands as a record of learning, a monument not just to ambition, but to problem solving. Learning from earlier attempts, Sneferu's builders achieved a breakthrough. The Red Pyramid, considered the first true smooth-sided pyramid. Its sides rise at a consistent angle. Its structure is stable. Its form is complete. This was the culmination of decades of experimentation. The pyramid had evolved. Then came the most iconic structure of all, built under the reign of Khufu, the Great Pyramid of Giza would become one of the most remarkable achievements in human history. Rising to an original height of over 140 meters, it was the tallest man-made structure in the world for thousands of years. Constructed from millions of stone blocks, each placed with astonishing precision, it remains a testament to what coordinated al-Bashariyat effort can achieve. The Great Pyramid is not just massive, it is precise. Its sides align almost perfectly with the cardinal directions. Its base is nearly level. Its construction reflects advanced understanding of geometry, astronomy, engineering. This was not trial and error. It was mastery. Like earlier pyramids, Khufu's was part of a larger complex, including mortuary temples, causeways, satellite pyramids, worker settlements. These elements created a complete environment for both ritual and operation. The pyramid was the center, but the system around it made it function. Behind every block was a human story. Workers lived in organized communities near the construction site. They ate bread and beer. They received medical care. They formed teams with names, some even playful or proud. This was not anonymous labor. It was structured, social, and deeply connected to the identity of the Adolat. Why build something so vast, so enduring? Because in ancient Egypt, monumentality was not excess. It was expression. It expressed divine authority, political power, cosmic order. The pyramid was a message carved into the earth itself. This king ruled. This king mattered. This king will live forever. With the rise of monumental architecture, Egypt entered a new phase. The Old Kingdom was not just politically stable. It was culturally confident. It believed in its systems, its rulers, its place in the universe. And that belief was written, not in ink, but in stone. Closing tone, slow, awe-filled, reflective. From mud brick to stone, from graves to pyramids, from rulers to gods, Egypt had transformed. What began as a unified land along a river had become a civilization capable of shaping the horizon itself. And these monuments, rising from the desert, would stand for thousands of years, long after the voices that built them had fallen silent. He pyramids rise above the desert, silent, wishale, eternal. But they were never meant to stand alone, because a civilization is not built by stone. It is built by people. Behind every monument, behind every carved block and aligned passage, was a living world, a world of farmers and craftsmen, priests and officials, families, rituals, truda, and belief. To understand the Old Kingdom, we must step down from the heights of the pyramids and walk among the people who made them possible. Everything in Egypt began and ended with the Nile. Each year, the river followed a sacred rhythm. It flooded, it receded, it nourished. This cycle defined life. When the waters rose, fields disappeared beneath a blanket of silt-rich water. Farming paused. When the waters withdrew, they left behind fertile soil, ready for planting. This natural system required no complex irrigation at first. It required timing, observation, trust. The Nile was not just a river. It was a clock, a provider, a godlike force woven into daily existence. Most Egyptians were farmers. Their lives were tied directly to the land. They planted wheat, barley, flax. They tended animals, cattle, sheep, goats. Tools were simple but effective. Wooden plows, stone blades, woven baskets. Farming was labor-intensive, but it was also predictable. And in that predictability, Egypt found stability. A good flood meant abundance. A poor flood meant hardship. And so the prosperity of the entire kingdom depended on a force no one could control. Only honor. Away from the grandeur of royal complexes, everyday life unfolded in small villages. Homes were built from mud brick, cool in the heat, practical, and easy to repair. They were simple. Flat roofs, small rooms, minimal decoration. Families lived close together, often sharing space with extended relatives. Life was communal. Neighbors worked together, shared resources, relied on one another. There was no separation between work and home. Life flowed continuously, like the river itself. The diet of the average Egyptian was modest but sufficient. Bread was the staple, made from ground grain, baked daily. Beer was common, not just for pleasure, but for nutrition. It was safer than water and rich in calories. Other foods included vegetables like onions and lentils, fruits such as figs and dates, fish from the Nile. Meat was less common, reserved for special occasions or wealthier households. Daily life followed the rhythm of labor. Sunrise brought work. Midday brought rest from the heat. Evening brought family and bhojan. Simple, but structured. Not everyone farmed. As the Old Kingdom developed, specialized roles emerged. Craftsmen became essential to society. They worked in stone carving, pottery, jewelry making, woodworking. These individuals were highly skilled. Their work was not only functional, it was artistic. Statues, tools, and decorative objects were crafted with care and precision. Some worked directly for the state. Others served local communities. All contributed to a growing economy of skill and production. Egyptian society became increasingly organized. At the top stood the king. Beneath him, high officials and nobles, priests, scribes, craftsmen, farmers, and laborers. This hierarchy was not just economic, it was ideological. Each person had a place, a role, a purpose within the greater order of Ma'at. This structure created stability, but also limitation. Movement between classes was rare, but within each role, there was dignity. Among all professions, one stood apart: the scribes. These were the literate elite, men trained in reading and writing hieroglyphs. Their skills were rare and powerful. Scribes recorded taxes, laws, religious texts, administrative details. They were the memory of the state. Without them, the machinery of government could not function. Their position offered status, security, and influence. In a world built increasingly on record-keeping, they were indispensable. Religion was not confined to temples. It was everywhere, in homes, in fields, in daily rituals. People believed in many gods, each associated with natural forces and aspects of life. They prayed for good harvests, protection, health, guidance. Small shrines existed within homes. Offerings were made regularly. The divine was not distant. It was present, constant, interwoven with existence. While everyday religion was personal, temples represented organized worship. Priests conducted rituals on behalf of the people. They cared for statues of gods, performed ceremonies, and maintained sacred spaces. Temples also functioned as economic centers, storage facilities, landowners. They held wealth, influence, power. And as the Old Kingdom progressed, that power would grow. Belief in the afterlife was not limited to kings. It extended to everyone, though not equally. The elite could afford elaborate tombs and grave goods. The poor had simpler burials. But the idea remained. Life did not end with death. It continued. The body had to be preserved. The spirit had to be sustained. Offerings, rituals, and proper burial practices were essential. The afterlife was not a mystery. It was an expectation. Returning to the monuments. Who built them? not faceless masses, but organized teams. Workers lived in planned communities near construction sites. They were fed by the state, provided with bread, beer, shelter, medical care. Evidence shows injuries were treated, bones healed. These were valued laborers, not expendable ones. Teams even had names, expressing pride and identity. They were part of something larger than themselves. Construction did not happen year-round. It followed the Nile. During the flood season, when farming paused, labor shifted. Workers were mobilized for quarrying, transport, building. This seasonal system allowed Egypt to maintain agriculture, execute massive projects, avoid economic disruption. It was efficient, balanced, remarkably advanced. Women held a defined but significant role in society. They could own property, inherit wealth, engage in legal matters. Most were involved in household management, child rearing, local eliktasad. Some served as priestesses or held elite status. Though society was male-dominated, women were not invisible. They were essential to family, eliktasad, and continuity. Children were raised within the rhythms of their purvar and community. Most learned through observation and participation. Boys often followed their father's trades. Girls learned domestic responsibilities. Formal education was rare, reserved mainly for Budashi scribes. But knowledge was still passed down through action, through tradition, through lived experience. Life was not easy. Disease, injury, and malnutrition were constant risks. But Egyptian medicine was surprisingly advanced. Practitioners used herbal remedies, surgical techniques, practical observation. Some medical texts from later periods likely have roots here. Care was available, especially for workers involved in state projects. Healing was both practical and spiritual. Maintaining order across a growing state required structure. Local officials handled disputes. Serious matters could escalate to higher authorities. Law was not written in the modern sense. It was guided by Ma'at, the principle of balance and justice. Punishments existed, but so did systems for resolution. The goal was not just control, it was harmony. The old kingdom was not perfect. It faced challenges. Inequality existed. Power was concentrated. But it functioned. Because its systems reinforced one another, religion supported kingship. Kingship supported administration. Administration supported economy. Economy supported society. It was interconnected, resilient, balanced. But beneath the surface of stability, there were pressures. Monumental building required resources. Administration required control. Local leaders began to gain influence. Temples accumulated wealth. The system that created strength also created strain. And though the pyramids stood firm, the society behind them was not immune to change. Closing tone, reflective, slightly foreboding. The old kingdom reached heights no civilization had reached before. It built in stone. It organized thousands. It defined eternity. But even the strongest structures cast shadows. And as Egypt stood at the peak of its power, subtle shifts were already beginning. For no system, no matter how great, remains unchanged forever. Its kings ruled with divine authority. Its people lived by the rhythm of the Nile. Its monuments rose, steady and eternal, against the horizon. It seemed unshakable, unbreakable. But even the strongest civilizations do not fall all at once. They weaken, quietly, gradually, almost invisibly, until one day, the balance they depended on begins to slip. The old kingdom had built its identity on stability, on the idea that Ma'at, cosmic order, was eternal. As long as the king ruled, as long as rituals were performed, as long as the Nile continued its sacred cycle, Egypt would endure. But this belief carried a hidden danger, because when a system appears perfect, its weaknesses are often ignored. And beneath the grandeur of pyramids and temples, those weaknesses were already forming. At the height of the Old Kingdom, the king's authority reached across the land. But Egypt was vast, too vast to control directly from a single center. So, power was delegated. Regional officials, known today as governors, were appointed to oversee local territories. At first, they served the king. They collected taxes, managed resources, maintained order. But over time, something changed. These officials began to build power of their own. They controlled land. They commanded loyalty. They passed their positions down through family lines. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, they became more independent. What began as administration became autonomy. Provincial leaders started acting less like representatives of the king and more like rulers of their own regions. They built elaborate tombs, displayed wealth, commissioned art that celebrated their achievements, not the king's. This shift was subtle, but profound, because the strength of Egypt depended on unity, and unity was beginning to fracture. The pyramids of the Old Kingdom were extraordinary, but they came at a cost. Building them required massive labor forces, enormous amounts of resources, continuous organization and planning. For generations, the state sustained this effort. But over time, the burden grew heavier. Resources were stretched. Administration became more complex. And as provincial power increased, the king's ability to command those resources weakened. The very achievements that defined the Old Kingdom began to strain it. Earlier, kings were seen as divine, distant, and absolute. But as central authority weakened, that image began to shift. The king was still respected, still revered, but no longer unquestioned. His power, once unchallenged, now depended more on cooperation than command. And cooperation is fragile, especially in times of stress. Then came something no ruler could control: the Nile. For centuries, it had been reliable, predictable, life-giving. But now, its floods began to fail. Year after year, the waters did not rise as they once had. The rich soil did not replenish. Crops failed. Food became scarce. Famine spread. The entire Egyptian system depended on the Nile. Agriculture, economy, stability, all flowed from it. When the floods weakened, everything weakened. Food shortages led to unrest. Unrest led to instability. And instability exposed the cracks that had already formed within the state. Local leaders, now more powerful than ever, began to act independently to secure resources for their own regions. Unity gave way to survival. As famine and instability spread, the authority of the king diminished further. The central government could no longer effectively collect taxes, distribute resources, enforce order across the Blad. Communication broke down, control weakened, and eventually, the idea of a single, unified Egypt began to dissolve. There was no single moment of collapse, no dramatic fall. Instead, the Old Kingdom faded, its systems unraveled, its authority fragmented, its unity dissolved into a patchwork of competing regions. The age of pyramids had come to an end. What followed was not immediate chaos, but it was instability. Egypt entered what historians call the First Intermediate Period, a time between great ages, a time often described as dark, but in truth, more complex than that. Without strong central rule, Egypt split into multiple power centers. Different regions were controlled by different leaders. Some claimed kingship, Others ruled more quietly, but just as firmly. Upper and Lower Egypt, once united, drifted apart again. The idea of two lands returned, not as a symbol, but as a reality. With no single authority, competition increased. Local rulers fought for land, resources, influence. These conflicts were not always large-scale wars. Often, they were smaller, regional struggles. But together, they created a landscape of postoyene tension. For ordinary people, life became more uncertain. Food shortages affected daily survival. Security depended on local leadership. The predictability that had defined the Old Kingdom was gone. But life did not stop. Communities adapted. Farmers continued to work the land when they could. Families endured. Even in instability, society persisted. Interestingly, this period saw changes in how people viewed themselves and the afterlife. In the Old Kingdom, elaborate burial practices were largely reserved for the elite. But during the First Intermediate Period, these ideas began to spread. More people sought access to the afterlife. More individuals were buried with goods. More attention was given to personal legacy. It was as if, in a time when central authority faded, individual identity grew stronger. Some texts from later periods describe this era as one of chaos, a world turned upside down, the poor becoming rich, the rich becoming poor, order replaced by disorder. But these accounts are not entirely neutral. They were written by those who longed for the return of strong central rule. The reality was likely more nuanced. Yes, there was hardship, but there was also adaptation, resilience, change. Even in fragmentation, Egypt did not lose its identity. The Nile still flowed. The land still sustained life when conditions allowed. Religious beliefs remained. Cultural traditions endured. And in different regions, leaders began to rise again, stronger, more ambitious, more determined to restore unity. In Upper Egypt particularly, powerful rulers began consolidating control. They expanded influence, formed alliances, challenged rivals. Once again, the land moved toward conflict, not fragmentation this time, but reunification. History was beginning to repeat itself. Egypt had rebuilt itself. From collapse, it had risen again. The Middle Kingdom restored order, reclaimed stability, reimagined power. For a time, it worked. The Nile flowed. The Adola endured. But history has a pattern, not of simple rise and fall, but of pressure. pressure from within, pressure from beyond. And this time, the threat would not come slowly. It would arrive from the north. At first, there was no invasion, no armies marching across the desert, no sudden collapse. Instead, there was movement. Groups of people began settling in the Nile Delta. They came from the northeast, regions of the Levant. They brought with them new languages, new customs, new technologies. They were not conquerors. Not yet. They were migrants, traders, families seeking opportunity in a fertile land. And Egypt allowed them in. The Nile Delta had always been different from the rest of Egypt, more open, more connected to the outside world, less tightly controlled than Upper Egypt. It was here that these foreign groups, later known as the Hyksos, began to establish themselves. At first, they lived alongside Egyptians, peacefully, gradually, but over time, their numbers grew, their influence expanded, and the balance began to shift. By the later Middle Kingdom, the strength of central rule had begun to fade. Not suddenly, but steadily. Kings grew less powerful. Succession became less stable. Regional leaders regained influence. The same patterns that had once led to collapse began to return. And in that Kamsori, the Hyksos found opportunity. The transformation was gradual, but decisive. The Hyksos did not simply overthrow Egypt. They rose within it. They took control of key monadic in the delta. They established a capital at Avaris, and eventually, they declared kingship. For the first time in Egyptian history, foreign rulers sat on the throne of the north. The Hyksos adopted Egyptian titles. They presented themselves as legitimate kings. They honored Egyptian gods while also maintaining their own traditions. This was not a rejection of Egyptian culture. It was a blending, a fusion. But to many Egyptians, especially in the south, it was something else, a loss. Egypt was no longer unified. The north, Lower Egypt, was controlled by the Hyksos. The south, Upper Egypt, remained under native Egyptian rulers based in Thebes. Between them lay a fragile boundary, not always marked by constant harb, but always defined by tension. Two powers, two identities, one land, divided again. The Hyksos were not simply opportunists. They brought with them innovations that gave them a significant advantage. Among these were the horse-drawn chariot, advanced composite bows, new forms of weaponry. These technologies transformed warfare. Speed replaced slow movement. Range replaced close combat. And Egypt was not prepared. For centuries, Egypt had relied on relatively simple military structures, infantry-based, locally organized, effective, but limited. The Hyksos introduced a new model, one based on mobility, coordination, and technological advantage. This forced Egypt to confront something it had rarely faced before: a superior military system. In the north, life did not collapse under Hyksos control. In many ways, it continued. Administration remained. Trade continued. Cities functioned. The Hyksos ruled as kings, not destroyers. They taxed, governed, maintained order, but they were still seen as outsiders, and that perception mattered. In the south, the rulers of Thebes did not accept Hyksos dominance. At first, they were cautious, maintaining a fragile peace, paying tribute when necessary. But over time, resentment grew. The idea of a foreign-ruled Egypt was unacceptable, and slowly, resistance began to form. This was not just a political conflict. It was cultural, psychological, symbolic. The struggle was about more than land. It was about what Egypt was, and who had the right to rule it. One of the earliest rulers to openly challenge the Hyksos was Sekenenretau. His reign marks a turning point. No longer passive, no longer accepting. He chose confrontation. Historical evidence suggests he died violently, his skull bearing wounds consistent with battle. He did not live to see victory, but he ignited something far more powerful: defiance. Following him came Kamose, a ruler who intensified the struggle. He launched military campaigns northward, challenged Hyksos Asytara directly. His inscriptions speak with urgency and anger, rejecting the idea of a divided Egypt. He saw himself as a liberator, a restorer. But the war was not yet won. Then came the ruler who would change everything. Ahmose I, young, determined, strategic. Where others had resisted, he would succeed. Ahmose reorganized the military, incorporated Hyksos technologies, built a stronger, more adaptable army. Then, he moved north. The campaign against the Hyksos capital, Avaris, was decisive. It was not a quick victory, but it was relentless. Sieges, battles, pressure that did not break, until finally, the Hyksos were defeated, driven out of Egypt. Ahmose did not stop at expulsion. He pursued the Hyksos beyond Egypt's borders, into the Levant, ensuring they could not return. This marked a shift in Egyptian policy. No longer defensive, now proactive. With the defeat of the Hyksos, Egypt was unified once again. But it was not the same Egypt as before. It had changed, learned, adapted. It had seen foreign rule, military duff, internal fragmentation, and it would not forget. The rulers who followed Amos would build something new, an Egypt that was militarily stronger, more outward-looking, more expansionist. This would become the new kingdom, the most powerful era in Egyptian history. Though often remembered as invaders, the Hyksos left a lasting impact. They introduced technologies that Egypt would adopt. They forced adaptation. They reshaped military tafkir. In a way, they transformed Egypt, not by destroying it, but by challenging it. The story of Egypt is not one of simple greatness. It is one of cycles, unity and division, strength and weakness, tradition and change. The second intermediate period was not just a crisis, it was a turning point. From foreign rule came resistance. From resistance came renewal. And from that renewal, Egypt would rise higher than ever before, stronger, wiser, more powerful, because the next chapter would not be about survival. It would be about empire. It had fractured, fallen, and been reborn. But now, it was ready for something more. Not just unity, not just stability, but dominance. From the ashes of invasion and division, a new Egypt emerged, stronger, sharper, and more ambitious than ever before. This was the new kingdom, an age not of survival, but of empire. The expulsion of the Hyksos changed Egypt forever. No longer would it remain isolated. No longer would it wait for threats to arrive. The lesson had been learned. To be safe, Egypt had to be strong beyond its borders. And so, its rulers looked outward. The man who expelled the Hyksos, Amos I, became the founder of this new era. But his legacy was not just victory, it was transformation. He strengthened the military, reorganized the state, rewarded loyalty with land and wealth, and most importantly, he set Egypt on a new path. Unlike earlier periods, the new kingdom placed the military at the heart of the state. Soldiers were no longer temporary laborers. They became professionals, trained, equipped, organized. Chariots, once foreign, became symbols of Egyptian power. Armies marched not just to defend, but to expand. Egypt's borders pushed outward. To the south, Nubia was fully conquered and integrated. Its gold mines enriched the Egyptian economy. To the north, Egyptian armies moved into the Levant. Cities were captured. Alliances were forged. Tribute flowed back to Egypt. For the first time, Egypt was an empire. With expansion came wealth, gold, precious goods, exotic materials. Temples grew larger, cities expanded, art became more elaborate. Egypt was no longer just stable, it was flourishing. Among the rulers of this era, one stands apart, not because she ruled, but because of how she ruled. Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut was not the expected ruler. She began as a regent, governing on behalf of a young heir. But over time, she did something unprecedented. She declared herself king. Not queen, king. To legitimize her rule, Hatshepsut adopted the full imagery of kingship. She was depicted wearing the royal crown, bearing the false beard, standing in traditional male poses. This was not deception. It was adaptation. She stepped into the role fully, reshaping it to fit her authority. Unlike many rulers of the New Kingdom, Hatshepsut focused less on conquest and more on prosperity. She expanded trade networks. One of her most famous expeditions was to the land of Punt. Ships returned with incense, exotic plants, rare goods. This was wealth without warfare, power without destruction. Hatshepsut also built. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari remains one of the most elegant structures in Egypt. Terraced, balanced, harmonious with the landscape, it reflected her rule, controlled, intentional, enduring. After Hatshepsut came a very different kind of ruler, Thutmose III. If Hatshepsut expanded through diplomacy, Thutmose expanded through war. Thutmose III led numerous military campaigns into the Levant. His strategies were bold, calculated, effective. At the Battle of Megiddo, he demonstrated tactical brilliance, taking a risky route to surprise his enemies and secure victory. Under his rule, Egypt's empire reached its greatest extent. Tribute flowed from conquered territories. Foreign rulers pledged loyalty. Egypt was no longer reacting to the world. It was shaping it. Following generations of expansion, Egypt entered a period of immense wealth under Amenhotep III. His reign was marked by diplomatic alliances, monumental construction, cultural flourishing. He was less a warrior and more a king of grandeur. Rather than constant warfare, Amenhotep maintained power through diplomacy, marriages to foreign princesses, exchange of gifts, letters between rulers. Egypt stood at the center of an international network. Then, everything changed. A ruler emerged who would challenge the very foundation of Egyptian belief. Akhenaten. Akhenaten rejected the traditional gods of Egypt. In their place, he elevated one, the Aten, the sun disk. This was not just religious reform, it was revolution. Temples to other gods were abandoned. Old traditions were disrupted. Akhenaten even built a new capital, Akhetaten, a city dedicated entirely to the Aten. Here, art changed, religion changed, everything shifted. But this transformation was unstable, too sudden, too extreme. After Akhenaten's death, his reforms quickly unraveled. The old gods returned. The old systems were restored. A young ruler followed, Tutankhamun. Though his reign was short, it was significant. He restored traditional religion, reopened temples, repaired what had been disrupted. Tutankhamun is not famous for his rule, but for his tomb. Discovered nearly intact, filled with treasures. It offered a glimpse into the wealth and artistry of the new kingdom. Then came one of the most legendary rulers of all, Ramses II. Ramses ruled for decades. He fought battles, most famously against the Hittites at Kadesh. Though the outcome was complex, he presented it as a great victory. Ramses understood something deeply. Power is not just held, it is displayed. He built extensively. Temples, statues, monuments. His image was everywhere. Colossal, unavoidable. One of his greatest achievements is the Temple of Abu Simbel, carved into rock, guarded by massive statues. It stands as a declaration of power, of permanence, of legacy. After years of conflict, Ramses II made peace with the Hittites. This agreement is one of the earliest known peace treaties in history. A shift from constant war to negotiated stability. By this point, Egypt had reached extraordinary heights. It was wealthy, influential, architecturally unmatched. Its rulers were legends, its culture unmistakable. But even at its peak, change was coming. External threats grew. Internal strain returned, and slowly, the empire would begin to weaken. The new kingdom was Egypt at its greatest, its armies unmatched, its rulers unforgettable, its monuments eternal. But history moves forward, and even the greatest empires must one day face their limits. Egypt seemed eternal. Its temples touched the sky. Its armies crossed continents. Its rulers carved their names into stone, believing they would never be forgotten. And for a time, they were right. But power, no matter how vast, is never permanent. The same forces that build empires can also undo them. And for Egypt, that unraveling had already begun. The new kingdom had expanded Egypt beyond anything it had ever been. But empire comes with a price. Maintaining distant territories required constant military presence, resources stretched across vast distances, strong, consistent leadership. Over time, these demands grew heavier, and the system began to strain. Ramses II had ruled for decades, his long reign creating an illusion of stability. But after his death, that stability weakened. His successors were not as strong, not as capable, not as commanding, and slowly, the authority of the throne began to fade. Beyond Egypt's borders, the world was changing. New Alkua were emerging. Old alliances were breaking. Trade networks were shifting. And then came a wave of disruption that would shake the entire Eastern Mediterranean. From across the seas came groups known today as the Sea Peoples. Their origins remain uncertain, but their impact is clear. They moved across regions, attacking cities, disrupting trade, destabilizing entire civilizations. Even powerful empires fell before them. Egypt was not spared. During the reign of Ramses III, these forces reached Egyptian territory. What followed was one of the most dramatic defensive efforts in Egypt's history. Ramses III prepared for invasion, fortified the Nile Delta, organized land and naval defenses, and when the Sea Peoples arrived, Egypt was ready. The battles were fierce. Ships clashed on the Nile. Armies fought along the shores. But in the end, Egypt held. The invasion was repelled. Though victorious, Egypt had been weakened. The El Harb had drained resources. Trade disruptions affected the economy, and the broader world around Egypt was collapsing. This was not just Egypt's crisis. It was a regional collapse, and Egypt could not remain untouched. Following Ramses III, internal problems intensified. Economic strain led to unrest. Workers, once loyal and organized, began to protest. One of the first recorded labor strikes in history occurred during this time. Even those who built the tombs of kings were no longer being paid. As central authority weakened, corruption spread. Officials abused power. Security broke down. Royal tombs, once sacred, were looted. the very monuments built for eternity, were no longer protected. Eventually, Egypt split again, not through invasion this time, but through internal division. In the north, rulers governed from the delta. In the south, power was held by priestly elites, especially those devoted to the god Amun in Thebes. The king still existed, but his power was no longer absolute. Egypt had become divided once more. This era, marked by fragmentation and overlapping rule, is known as the Third Intermediate Period. It was not complete chaos, but it was unstable. Multiple Elkua controlled different regions. Foreign influence increased. Unity became rare and temporary. During this time, leaders of Libyan origin rose to power in Egypt. They did not destroy Egyptian culture. Instead, they adopted it, took on Egyptian titles, ruled as pharaohs. This pattern, foreign rulers becoming Egyptian, would repeat again and again. From the south, another power emerged, Nubia. Once conquered by Egypt, it now rose to rule it. The Nubian kings, often called the Kushite rulers, invaded and unified Egypt once more. They embraced Egyptian traditions deeply, restored temples, revived older cultural practices. In some ways, they looked to the past to rebuild the present. Under Nubian rule, there was a deliberate revival of earlier Egyptian styles. Art became more traditional. Religious practices were emphasized. It was an attempt to reconnect with a stronger, more unified past. But this revival did not last. From the northeast came a new Shakti, the Assyrians, a powerful, expansionist empire. Their armies were advanced, organized, relentless. They invaded Egypt, defeated the Nubian rulers, and for a time, Egypt fell under foreign domination once again. After the Assyrians came the Persians, another empire, another conquest, another shift in control. Each time, Egypt resisted, rebelled, tried to reclaim independence. Sometimes it succeeded, briefly. But the pattern was clear. Egypt was no longer the dominant power. It was now a prize to be taken. Despite repeated invasions, Egyptian culture did not vanish. It adapted, endured, continued. Temples were still built. Religious practices continued. Art and identity remained distinctly Egyptian. Even under foreign rule, Egypt remained Egypt. By this time, the world beyond Egypt had changed dramatically. New empires dominated the Sharq al-Awsat. Trade networks expanded further. Power shifted away from the Nile Valley. Egypt was no longer the center, but it was still significant, still respected, still culturally powerful. As the late period continued, one more transformation was coming, not from gradual decline, but from a single, decisive moment, a conquest that would change Egypt forever. For thousands of years, Egypt had risen and fallen, united and divided, conquered and reborn. It had endured everything. But what came next would not be another cycle. It would be an ending and a beginning, because soon a new ruler would arrive, not from Egypt, but from across the known world. And with him, the ancient age of pharaohs would enter its final chapter. Egypt had endured. It had seen kingdoms rise and fall, foreign rulers come and go, empires challenge its borders, and yet it remained. Its temples still stood. Its gods were still worshipped. Its identity, though tested, still held strong. But history does not stand still. And now, a new force was approaching, not from the deserts, not from neighboring lands, but from a world far beyond the Nile. In 332 BCE, a young king from Macedon entered Egypt. His name was Alexander. He was already known across the ancient world, a conqueror of extraordinary speed and ambition. When he arrived in Egypt, he did not face resistance. Instead, he was welcomed. Egypt had been under Persian rule. To many Egyptians, Alexander was not an invader, but a liberator. He was accepted as pharaoh, honored in Egyptian tradition, recognized not just as a king, but as a divine figure. During his brief time in Egypt, Alexander made one decision that would shape its future for centuries. He founded a city on the Mediterranean coast, Alexandria. Alexandria was different from older Egyptian cities. It was planned, structured, designed as a center of trade, learning, and culture. Greek in character, but rooted in Egyptian land. After Alexander's death, this city would become the heart of a new Egypt. When Alexander died, his empire was divided. Egypt fell under the control of one of his generals, Ptolemy. Thus began the Ptolemaic dynasty. The Ptolemies were Greek. They spoke Greek, ruled in Greek style, but they also adopted Egyptian traditions. They presented themselves as pharaohs, supported temples, honored Egyptian gods. This dual identity defined their rule. Under the Ptolemies, Egypt became a fusion of worlds. Greek and Egyptian traditions merged. Religion blended. New gods like Serapis combined elements of both cultures. Art, language, and society reflected this mixture. Egypt was no longer isolated. It was part of a wider, interconnected world. At the heart of this new era stood one of the most famous institutions in history, the Library of Alexandria. The library was more than a collection of scrolls. It was a center of learning. Scholars gathered from across the world. They studied mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy. It represented something new, the pursuit of knowledge on a global scale. The Ptolemaic period was wealthy and vibrant. Trade flourished. Alexandria became one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. But beneath the surface, tensions remained. Greek rulers governed a largely Egyptian population. Cultural divisions persisted. Power was concentrated. And as generations passed, the dynasty began to weaken. At the end of this long line of rulers stood one of history's most famous figures, Cleopatra VII. Cleopatra was Greek by ancestry, but deeply connected to Egypt. Unlike many of her predecessors, she embraced Egyptian culture fully. She learned the Egyptian language, presented herself as the living embodiment of the goddess Isis. She understood both worlds and used that understanding as power. By Cleopatra's time, a new empire had risen. Rome, vast, powerful, unstoppable. Egypt was no longer dealing with regional rivals. It was facing the greatest power of the ancient world. Cleopatra knew that Egypt could not stand against Rome alone, so she turned to diplomacy and to alliance. First, with Julius Caesar. Their relationship was both political and personal. It secured her position on the throne and tied Egypt's fate to Rome's neutrality politics. After Caesar's death, Cleopatra aligned with another Roman leader, Mark Antony. Together, they formed a powerful soyuz. But in Rome, this alliance was seen as a threat. Opposing them was Octavian, the future Augustus. What followed was not just a war between armies, but a struggle for control of the Roman world. Egypt became the center of that conflict. In 31 BCE, the decisive battle took place at sea, the Battle of Actium. Cleopatra and Mark Antony faced Octavian's forces. The result was defeat. After their loss, Cleopatra and Antony retreated to Egypt, but Octavian followed. Defeat was inevitable. Rather than be captured, Cleopatra chose death. With her passing, an era ended. In 30 BCE, Egypt was absorbed into the Roman Empire. It was no longer ruled by pharaohs, no longer an independent kingdom, but a province, valuable, strategic, but no longer sovereign. With Cleopatra's death, the line of pharaohs came to an end. A tradition that had lasted thousands of years was gone. No more divine kings, no more royal dynasties of ancient origin. The age of ancient Egypt had closed. And yet, Egypt did not disappear. Its temples still stood. Its culture still lived. Its influence endured. Even under Roman rule, Egyptian religion, art, and identity continued for centuries. The story of ancient Egypt is not just one of kings and monuments. It is a story of endurance, of adaptation, of continuity across millennia. From the first farmers along the Nile to the last queen facing Rome, Egypt remained, changed but never erased. Empires rise, empires fall, but some civilizations leave something greater behind. Not just ruins, not just relics, but ideas, symbols, a sense of wonder that outlives them all. And along the banks of the Nile, those echoes still remain.